Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to make this statement on mainstreaming public-private partnerships in the provision of public infrastructure and services. Ghana in the last decade has faced a critical infrastructure and public service deficit heightened by fiscal constraints, rising debt levels, and limited access to international capital markets. The demand for road investments, energy, healthcare, water, and education far exceeds the government's financial capacity to deliver at any point in time. Traditional financing mechanisms such as domestic revenue, foreign loans, and donor grants have become increasingly difficult to mobilize. To contain the situation, most administrations resort to cutting government expenditure, but this also has the risk of cutting growth and limiting job creation. Globally, many governments are growing a deepened interest in the use of public-private partnerships as a viable alternative route to bridge the infrastructure and public service finance gap. PPPs in this context, Mr. Speaker, refers to arrangements where the private sector assumes significant financing and project management risk and responsibility for delivering public infrastructure or services over a medium to long-term period. Ghana's PPP journey began in the early 2000s. Until recently, however, there was no comprehensive legal framework governing these partnerships. In 2011, the government introduced a national PPP policy to guide the structuring and implementation of projects. In the year 2020, Parliament passed and the President assented to Act 1039, which provides a structured legal framework for PPPs. Mr. Speaker, it's fair to say that the PPP ecosystem in Ghana is still in its nascent phases. Nonetheless, a limited number of projects have been developed within this ecosystem, and these include parts of the Tema Motorway Expansion Project and part of the Boankra Inland Port Project, among others. By leveraging private sector capital, technical expertise, and innovation, PPPs can deliver essential projects more effectively, more efficiently as well, while reducing the financial burden on the government. PPPs have the added advantage of strengthening the private sector as it provides long-term business opportunities. We observe, however, Mr. Speaker, that the development of further PPPs are facing some challenges, and I want to highlight a few and make some recommendations. First, there's a low level of awareness and preference for PPPs within both the public and the private sector. Most private and public institutions prefer outright contracts between the government and private sector players, where the private sector delivers and the government is obliged to pay. And as a result, project promoters hardly prefer PPP models. Public institutions will also rather turn down a promoter because of limited funds than structure a proposed project as a PPP project. Second, Mr. Speaker, there's limited capacity for structuring, modeling, and negotiating PPP transactions. Even where there exists an appetite for a PPP structure, there's limited capacity in modeling and negotiation, both on the private sector side and then on the public sector side. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, regulatory and bureaucratic bottlenecks inherent in the current PPP Act slow down the process of negotiating and executing transactions. Anecdotal evidence suggests in some cases that it takes close to a year to even be able to put one project together. Fourthly, Mr. Speaker, the very nature of PPP projects apportion part of the financing and management risk to the private sector partners. These high risks are then compounded by other national risks like the macro risks of inflation and exchange rate depreciation, and this discourages a lot of private sector players. Mr. Speaker, finally, if we are going to mainstream PPPs in delivering on the infrastructure and public service deficit in this country, a few recommendations that will urge on the government to consider. First, we need to improve the level of awareness and acceptability of PPPs. It's important for increased public and stakeholder engagement to mainstream PPPs in infrastructure and service delivery. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we have to improve specialized PPP capacity enhancement. Government needs to deepen investment in specialized training for government officials when it comes to negotiation, risk assessment, and financial structuring. And then the consulting groups such as the lawyers, the accounting firms, and the project management firms also need to deepen their capacity of their specialists in modeling and structuring. A third recommendation, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to de-risk investments and ensure bankability. We've got to work more to introduce credit enhancement mechanisms such as government-backed guarantees to attract investors. For example, at the Ministry of Housing, where I was recently, we did some work on de-risking housing PPPs by providing some incentives to include some of the things that people find risky, like land and other incentives. Mr. Speaker, the PPP Act itself, though new, may require some immediate amendment to some sections and enforcement of others. And I'll raise a few examples. Section 77 of the PPP Act has to be made more robust to reduce some of the bottlenecks in project implementation when it comes to the project development facility. The regulations to the Act itself also need to be passed quite quickly to fill the gray areas and simplify implementation. Finally, Mr. Speaker, government needs to package a pipeline of bankable PPPs on infrastructure and public services and regularly embark on roadshows to attract potential PPP partners. This will fast-track the rollout of PPP projects in the country. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, public-private partnerships present a strategic solution to Ghana's infrastructure and public service challenge. It offers a pathway to sustainable development without overburdening public finances. I want to urge the government to pay attention to the PPP option and to mainstream it in delivering infrastructure and services for the benefit of the Ghanaian people. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity.